This is it, my final episode before the election. That does not mean it'll be my final episode before we know who wins the presidency, because who knows how long that'll take. But now is the time for me to warn you about election night and the role that the news industry probably takes in your life that night. It takes an increasing role in the weeks leading up to the big night as well. But election night is what some folks in the industry call the Super Bowl of news. So much of what you get exposed to for those excruciating hours is designed to manipulate you, to reel you in for financial reasons. And that has real consequences. Ahead, I'm going to tell you about a time when I started hearing from people freaking out about how an election was looking based on the returns that they were seeing come in. But what those returns actually showed was the opposite of what they looked like. I'll explain. But first, the newspaper endorsements fiasco. I've been hearing from so many listeners about this. The Washington Post and LA Times are not endorsing a candidate in the presidential race, even though they have been making clear repeatedly that Trump represents an existential threat to democracy and Kamala respects the fundamentals of democracy. People have been asking me how much this endorsement thing matters, and if it does matter a lot, then why? Ahead, I'm going to explain, and I'll explain some crucial things that have been missing in the media coverage of this. And looking into this, I discovered a serious question about whether at least one of these owners even knows what his own role is, and whether his staff knows what he thinks his role is. It's a mess. And yes, it matters big time, including for the fight against the forces of fascism on the right and on the far left. Plus, I have some advice for you on how to handle election night and maximize your chances of sanity. Speaking of that, I have a bonus section for you, and you'll hear why. It's something positive and hopeful that has nothing to do with the election. That's right, an actual reason for optimism in the world outside of what's going on here. It's something that you won't hear about in the major media because they refuse to cover it. Plus, the pillars of creation. No, I'm not getting religious on you here. That is a scientific term, and it speaks to the biggest story of all that I think might be helpful. All that's coming up today on They Stand Corrected. Hello and welcome. I'm Josh Lebs, and this is episode 30 of my podcast, They Stand Corrected, that fact-checks the news. 30 episodes in. Wow. This exists because of your support. So thank you so much to everyone who is making this possible. If this is your first time, here's the quick rundown. I spent 20 years inside mainstream media, 10 on NPR and 10 at CNN. I was a fact-checker on air and online, fact-checking all kinds of things. I also saw how often the news media get things wrong because they report things that aren't fact-checked. It sucks, it's damaging society, and we need to fix it. With each episode, I send out a newsletter packed with links and images and more, and I encourage you to check that out because I don't expect you to take my word for anything. Anyone can get that newsletter for free. It's all at my website, joshlebs.com. The people making it possible for this show to continue are those who choose to support it by becoming paid subscribers at the newsletter. That comes with a bunch of perks. You get exclusive content. In fact, I showed my paid subscribers a way to access just about any news article for free. Totally legal, legit way to do it. I show my paid subscribers that, and they're the ones who most often send me the topics that I cover here on this show. I want to help get you prepared for election night in a way that might even help protect your mental health a bit amid what the news media does for hours that night. But first, the newspaper endorsements fiasco. So many people are understandably confused about this and what it means. The LA Times and then the Washington Post suddenly announced that they will not have endorsements in the presidential race this year. That in and of itself made big news nationally, especially when the Washington Post did it. Here is MSNBC host Nicole Wallace, who, by the way, was part of Republican John McCain's presidential campaign back in 2008.
For the first time in 36 years, the Washington Post editorial board will not endorse a candidate for president. Washington Post CEO Will Lewis writes this about the non-endorsement today, quote, "We see it as consistent with the values the Post has always stood for and what we hope for in a leader. Character and courage in service to the American ethic, veneration for the rule of law, and respect for human freedom in all its aspects. I don't even know what that means.
No one does, because it was just one of those statements where someone sticks together some flowery prose and pretends it's a point. And here is a report from The Hill that included some relevant recent history from both papers.
The paper supported Biden in 2020 and Clinton in 2016 and published those endorsements much earlier in the cycle.
It all comes as the LA Times editorial editor resigned this week after billionaire owner Dr. Patrick Soon-Shiong prohibited the paper from making an endorsement, as it had for every presidential race since 2008.
These papers have also been endorsing candidates in other races. The Washington Post is owned by a billionaire also, Jeff Bezos, founder of Amazon. It's not like there are all these voters around the country who are going to make their voting decisions based on what these newspaper endorsements say. There could be some, and every vote does matter a lot. But that's not the big problem here. This is a story of what happens when non-journalists own giant journalism operations, and those non-journalists prove themselves to be so easily frightened. Part of what's so messed up here is that this is where the owners decide to get involved, not when it comes to the biases in reporting that I've talked to you about. To understand this, we need to take it one step at a time. First, a lot of this reporting doesn't make clear what a newspaper endorsement even is. These are not the staff of newspapers voting or something. These are from editorial boards. I did an episode about editorial boards, episode 14. You can scroll back in your feeds and find it. I'll link to it in the show notes and the newsletter. There's a relatively small number of professional opinion writers and editors. At the Washington Post, there are 10 people currently listed as making up the editorial board there. According to reporting by the Post, an endorsement for Kamala Harris was all set to go, and then Jeff Bezos jumped in and said no. Trump has been openly threatening Jeff Bezos and his businesses, and threatening news agencies in general. Here is Robert Kagan. He was editor-at-large of the Washington Post, and he's among those who resigned after the Post did this. He was interviewed by CNN.
This is clearly an effort by Bezos to try to get on Trump's good side in advance of his presidency. If we want to know how Trump is going to stifle the free press in the United States, this is the answer. This is how it's going to happen, especially when the media is owned by corporate titans who have a lot to lose if Trump is angry at them.
More and more staffers resigned, and people have been canceling their subscriptions. NPR reported more than 200,000 people canceled digital subscriptions. Facing all this pressure, Jeff Bezos has now weighed in. He published an op-ed in the Post. Here is part of what it said.
What presidential endorsements actually do is create a perception of bias, a perception of non-independence. Ending them is a principled decision, and it's the right one.
He also insisted that it was just a coincidence that the head of one of his companies, Blue Origin, met with Trump the same morning that this decision was announced. He said that meeting was scheduled quickly. He did not say a word about the threats from Trump or anything. He just insisted that his personal interests had nothing to do with this. But really, what goes on in his mind is not the point. If you want a newspaper to end endorsements in general, do so way before you even know who any candidates are in any race. Announce after an election season is over. We will no longer be doing this. To do it right before Trump could get power and try to make your life miserable obviously sends the message to Trump and others that threats work. But it gets even worse. In previous episodes, I pointed out that the Washington Post on its news side, not just its op-eds, is so deeply bigoted against Israel, it might be the worst major news outlet in America on this stuff. The Post has leaders guiding their coverage of the Middle East who are former employees of the Qatari government. They were executives at Qatar's state-owned propaganda giant known as Al Jazeera. And because I know that owners do sometimes get involved, I have reached out to corporate execs. I've written to Jeff Bezos. I've heard nothing, and things have not gotten any better. So when it comes to the big lie of the left, this imaginary big bad Israel, Bezos won't lift a finger. The Post keeps publishing messed up stories that fuel dangerous anti-Semites, and he won't do anything about it. Now, when the newspaper's editorial board wants to take this official stand against the chief purveyor of the big lie of the right, this whole idea of a stolen election as part of a great replacement theory, now Jeff Bezos is pulling those punches. He is letting anti-democratic forces run rampant on the left, and now showing fear of anti-democratic forces on the right. I've also heard from people inside the Post about hypocrisy among staff. As one journalist there put it, inside the Post, all these people are saying that the canceling of subscriptions over this lack of endorsements is a sign that the Post was wrong. But when people cancel over the anti-Israel bias, then these same people are saying, oh, we must ignore all the people canceling. We must remain independent and not let them influence us. All right, let's jump over to the LA Times. Owner Patrick Soon-Shiong spoke to Spectrum News about his decision.
I think my fear is if we chose either one, that it would just add to the division. And look what's happened to the Twitter feed that's gone a little crazy when we just said, you decide.
That you decide argument is bogus. Of course people decide. But just like with the Washington Post, the LA Times has endorsed in lots of races and was planning to endorse Kamala on this one. And suddenly here, a billionaire owner gets involved. He has done nothing about anti-Israel nonsense in the LA Times. Maybe because there's no powerful figure threatening his mega wealth. But on this, here he is. There's also something else he said in the interview. Listen closely to this.
As an owner, I'm on the editorial board, and I shared with our editors that maybe this year we have a column, a page, 2 pages if we want, of all the pros and all the cons, and let the readers decide.
Did you hear the words he said at the top there? As an owner, I'm on the editorial board. Well, that might be news to the LA Times itself because they list who the members of their editorial board are. There's only 5 of them, and he's not one of them. And just so you know, I didn't hear him wrong. His quote is also written out by Spectrum News. So, serious question. Does he think he's on the editorial board? Is he? Does the staff know that he thinks he is? I contacted the LA Times for comment on this and have not heard back. Owners of news agencies, it's time for you to either stay out completely or weigh in favor of the fight for democracy. That means standing up to fascist forces on the right and the far left. We need news agencies to do that and never waver or show fear against those threats, whether it's a presidential candidate or screaming crazy protesters on college campuses. Do not capitulate. I'll be right back. I am not often speechless, as you can guess, but your responses to my recent speech from the October 7th anniversary have left me speechless. I am still amazed by them. Thank you to those of you who have not had a chance to check it out. There is a video and audio and transcript available. You can find that in the show notes and in the newsletter. I'm hearing from more and more organizations around the country and around the world that want to know if I do events. And I do. You know, in this era that we're living in with so much noise, it's always a great experience to travel and meet people directly. So if you're interested in having me come to an event or organization near you, just check out the link in the show notes or at my website, joshlebs.com. You know how people tell you not to leave all the lights on, like in your home or office when you're gone, because that's a waste of energy? I often think of that, but with human energy. Tons of human energy being wasted. On election night, millions of people become glued to the news on their phones, computers, radios, TV, whichever format, and it doesn't make a difference. Unless you're working in politics, there's no reason to search for tea leaves in early results, or to fixate on every little result. If that is somehow entertaining to you, then obviously go for it. But if it's painful, if it's an emotional roller coaster, don't. Think back to previous election nights over the years and any emotional rise that you might have been going through then. Looking back, did those hours benefit you in any way? They had no impact on the result, obviously. I mean, look, put in all the work you can into getting out the vote and getting people educated and making sure that they vote for democracy and all these things. But once election night arrives, all that human energy in anticipation is not helpful. And news agencies know that by giving you little drips and drabs along the way, they can keep you hooked, even though those little bits of information can often specifically mislead you, even about how the results themselves are looking. In 2022, there was a Senate runoff race where I live in Georgia. People all over the country were watching this very closely, partly because there's such a closely divided Senate, but also because the Republican candidate was probably the most clueless person we have ever seen run for any political office at any level. Just to show you how high the stakes were for this very powerful position, here was Herschel Walker at some kind of campaign event where he weirdly started saying that America's air kept trading places with China's air.
Since we don't control the air, our good air decided to float over to China, bad air.
Here's a worse one. After a horrific school shooting in Texas in which 19 children and 2 adults were killed, Herschel Walker was interviewed on Fox. They asked what he would do about this kind of problem, and here's what he said.
Cain killed Abel, and that's a problem that we have. And I said, what we need to do is look into how we can stop those things. He talked about doing a disinformation. What about getting a department that can look at young men, that's looking at women, that's looking at just social media? What about doing that, looking into things like that, and we can stop that way?
Of course, Fox did not push him on what he meant or was talking about. Neither did right-wing media in general. So you can tell how high the stakes were for this election. He was up against Raphael Warnock, who is a good, intelligent human being aware of reality. As these results were coming in, I was hearing from people all over the country, not just Democrats, but also independents and sane Republicans who were horrified that we might be at a place in which even Herschel Walker could win. Some of these folks contacting me started freaking out when the news they were following on their phones or wherever showed the race incredibly close. They heard lines like this from someone on MSNBC who stands next to those big maps and breaks them down. His name is Steve Kornacki.
This is probably good news for Walker. He's already ahead of his November level, and it's only Election Day vote we think left to come in Hall County. So an opportunity for Walker perhaps to build on that Election Day vote.
Some got really worried when they heard this.
And technically Walker ahead by about 2,000 votes right now.
Okay, so I was hearing from people saying, what's happening? Is he going to win? But I knew what was actually happening. At that point, when reports were showing that Walker was technically ahead, Republicans in Georgia saw that Herschel Walker was going to lose. Heavily Democratic areas were still going to come in. Even that wasn't clear to a lot of people. There's a term for this. It's called a mirage. Here's CBS News explaining this idea in the last presidential election in 2020.
Some will report results sooner than others, so initial numbers could be misleading and confusing. These so-called mirages will disappear as more ballots are counted, but experts are warning that it could take days or even weeks.
Those mirages help fuel conspiracy theories, though. Trumpists say, hey, Republicans were winning, and then along come Democrats and change the results, which is obviously not what's happening. One way to help avoid this would be if the media would pull out of the weeds and show the big picture. That, sure, you're seeing these maps and these little numbers, but the big picture is this. At this point, the Warnock campaign is increasingly confident that they're going to win, and here's why. That really should be the big line that people are getting. Even though you don't know what's going to happen, and you emphasize that as well, you should keep showing the big picture, but very often the news doesn't. They want to keep you hanging on every little incremental change. The more they can do that to make it seem like something big and new has just happened, the more they hold on to you. To be fair, if you listen really closely to MSNBC or to other places, you can sometimes hear this information in there, but you shouldn't have to listen super intently to try to catch the moments in which they say that stuff. Here's part of the irony. When social media platforms do stuff like this, news agencies report on it. Here's a clip from an NPR report in 2021. The guy being interviewed here is Tristan Harris, president of the Center for Humane Technology.
We've never had supercomputers pointed at our brains perfectly able to stimulate our emotions and know more about us than we know about ourselves. It knows that, resonant frequency, the minor seventh of which anger to put into your nervous system next.
With news agencies, it's not that precise. It's more like a blunt instrument. But they don't need precision that night. Among people in this country who are passionate voters, which leaves out a large portion of the population who don't vote, when they don't care, But among those who do, there are strong emotions in both directions that give news agencies the chance to reel people in. I have ideas for how you can avoid that coming up. In the world of podcasting, reviews and ratings are currency, and it's a super cool currency because you can provide it for free. It doesn't cost you anything except maybe like 15 seconds of your time. So any platform you're listening on, click to rate this and give it a great review. The reviews are amazing. Thank you so much to people providing them. Some people use their name, some don't. This latest one on Apple Podcasts does not have a full name on it, but I want to thank whoever this is. This is what this person wrote. It really helps digest the sensationalized headline tidbits that can be so misleading. I have always considered Josh Lev's reporting to be balanced and informative. You know, old-fashioned investigative reporting with research, background, sources. What do they call it? Oh yes, truthful and accurate reporting. I call it real journalism. Wow, thank you so much for that, folks. Stuff like this makes such a big difference. If you are someone who has been gaining anything from, let's see, 30 episodes, so we're talking approximately 15 hours of content that I've given you so far here. If you could take 15 seconds to rate and review, it would mean so much. Thank you. This is going to sound unrelated, but follow me here. There is an image that NASA captured earlier this year. I'm putting it into the newsletter so you can see it yourself. It is striking and beautiful. It's from space, so it has a black background, obviously, but it's filled with thousands of dots of what look like white light and larger glowing dots of all these different shining colors, oranges, blues, pinks, reds. It's a stunning field of color. This image was taken around 162,000 light years from Earth. It shows what's called a globular cluster, which is this densely packed group that can hold millions of stars. Actually, I'll post a link to a bunch of photos for you, including one called Pillars of Creation, where new stars are being formed. There's no bigger story for humanity than the fact that the universe is vast in a way that we can't conceive. When I find myself getting caught up in bad things happening on Earth or worries about things in the news, it helps me to look at these photos and remember that vastness. All right, it doesn't negate in any way how important it is to fight the good fight here. Obviously, our microscopic dot of the universe is precious. It's everything for us, and fighting for it and for humanity and for America, all this, it is essential. It's also true that we don't know how it all fits together, why things are the way they are, what it all leads to. When I look in these pictures, I find this a chance to breathe. But there's also something else I do that, in a way, is the opposite. I drill down into smaller and smaller units here on Earth. I think of these concentric circles. In the middle, there's a point, which is myself. Then around that, my family, the people I provide for and care for. Around that, my community, and that can mean whatever community means for you. And it expands outward from there. If you feel overwhelmed, like you can't get the result you want for the country in the news, it can help you to think of these concentric circles too. Around you, what can you influence? I spent years covering the worst stories in the news. My job at CNN was very unusual. Every day when I would go in, I would look to fact check or report on whatever the biggest stories in the world were. And very often those were the worst things that we knew of that were happening. I had to learn tricks like this about how to limit my ride on the emotional roller coaster. If you go into that night trying to keep in mind all that context, the vastness of the universe and the little things that you actually can change around you, you might find that it helps you the way it helped me. On that night itself, plan to watch a movie you've been wanting to see, or read a book you've been wanting to read, or talk to a friend you've been wanting to catch up with. There will not be any massive news about the result of the election before late that night at the earliest. And you will get alerted if something huge happens. Of course you will. To that end, I have a bonus section for you this week. It's a hopeful story that exists totally outside of the election. There are people making big strides forward that we can support. So listen to it now, or save it for election night if you want. Actually, share it with everyone and tell them to listen also. I'll be back on the other side with a quick note about what I'll be up to on election night that you will be able to see. Fatema Alharbi is from Bahrain. She was part of the Youth Olympics back in 2008 in Beijing, and she continued in athletic competitions for Bahrain. She's a champion in track and field. She did both long jump and triple jump. She has joined a group called Sharaka, which means partnership in Arabic. It's all about building connection outside of the government between people in various Arab nations and Israelis. Despite stereotypes, Arab and Jewish people work together every day and are close friends and in loving relationships and married to each other and having kids together. In Israel, Sharaka is about building relationships across different countries in the wake of what is officially referred to as the Abraham Accords, which are really diplomatic agreements between these countries which were not at war. And by the way, the Abraham Accords is a result of years and years of work, going back at least a decade, not something that the Trump administration magically created, despite all this lore about that. Anyway, here is something that's left out of the media. The big news organizations refuse to report on this group or interview her or anything about it. And I know that because I got a chance to talk with her. We discussed that and her experience.
I always wanted to go visit Israel because, unfortunately, the media in the Arab world doesn't get us the full story. And I always question things, wanted to know more. And I always have this critical thinking, So when the Abraham Accord happened and Sharaka was established, they invited me to come visit Israel. And I, of course, wanted the opportunity so I can see the reality myself, hear the other narrative, meet real people. And that trip actually changed my whole life. It brought me, of course, so much backlash, but it also brought so much opportunity for me to learn and to grow and also to advocate for peace since that day.
It took bravery for you to say that you were going to do this, knowing how many people across that whole stretch of the world have been radicalized by lies, including in the media.
Of course, because of everything I posted and the media interviews that I did on Israeli channels, everyone back home and in the Arab world knew that I'm in Israel. The first thing that they did, everyone kept saying, she's not Arab, she's not Muslim, I'm a traitor to Islam, to the Arabs, but also that I'm part of a propaganda campaign by the Israeli government that paid me millions of dollars to say good things about Israel. And believe me to say, I don't have any millions of dollars. I was just a tourist that wanted to see Israel. And they tried to hack my account. They tried to silence me. They tried to cancel me. Anything you can imagine, I have received that.
Did this happen in the media?
It didn't happen in the Bahraini media, but it happened, for example, on Al Jazeera channel. It happened on X, Twitter, and Instagram. So social media platforms or other Arab media or Iranian-backed channels. They don't broadcast in Bahrain, but they did a video about me in an Iranian channel. The people kept putting it on social media platforms. So that's the way that it got around the country.
These governments count on people continuing to have this false view of Israel. The last thing they want is for anyone to go see the real Israel and gain levels of mutual understanding. Because when people see a democratic nation in the region in which people choose their own leaders, it might mean that they then push for the same thing at home. These people who are rushing onto Qatari and Iranian media are part of a constructed effort to intimidate anyone else from going and doing the same thing and believing you. So what you saw in Israel, have you been able to share that on the Bahraini media or no?
Yes, but in a very minimum coverage. The best that I did in Bahrain is through my own social media.
You said it changed your life to go to Israel. Was it because you realized you had been taught lies, including in the media, or what was it that changed?
Yeah, I think the first thing is actually the media, because thankfully, I grew up in a home that I've never been taught to hate Israelis or Jews. Even the schools didn't teach us about that. But, the teachers and their stories or the community, and most important is the media that actually shares a lot of hateful content and propaganda and lies about the reality of Israel or even the conflict. I was afraid because what I heard about Israel my whole life, I can't erase that in like 1 second. But the moment I landed and I went to the streets and met with real people, I realized that all I knew my whole life about this place is lies and propaganda. It's very obvious that those media outlets are pushing special agendas.
The U.S. media, mainstream news outlets, should be all over you. They should be lining up for opportunities to interview you. Are you finding that in the United States, mainstream big outlets are taking the opportunity to talk with you, or has that been limited also?
For the huge media outlets here in the US, it's very limited. We got coverage from like a state level media outlets, channels, and newspapers, but national, no, very limited.
What's it like for you in Bahrain when you're back? Are you in danger?
No, thankfully, I always say that I'm fortunate that I'm from Bahrain. We live in a very peaceful country. The laws are strong and no one can harm me physically. I think the hateful content in Bahrain is only online. I feel very safe in Bahrain, and I feel protected actually in Bahrain more than in any other country. I feel on my safety actually when I come to the US, seeing everything happening, the radicalism and extremism that we actually don't have, and it's not tolerated in Bahrain.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And I'm sure you've seen about the attacks on Jewish people here.
Yeah.
Do you have hope for increased cooperation and understanding in the future between Bahrain and general Middle Eastern, North African nations and Israel?
When October 7 happened, it actually made me lose hope, and I felt like this is the end. But it was a real test actually for the Accords. But right after, we could see our leaders condemning what Hamas did. And even a year later, if they get asked today again about the Abraham Accord, they will still take the decision. So I think that shows it's very positive. And also at the same time, the economic numbers, I mean, it's only increasing comparing this year to last year. So on every level, it's very hopeful. Yeah, that's what makes me hopeful that the Abraham Accord is not only surviving, but it's thriving. And my only hope for that more countries actually join the Abraham Accords, and that will be a major success.
Well, you're giving me hope too. Thanks. That was awesome. Wow, it's so exciting. That's so positive to hear. A reason for optimism, right? She is so cool. I also spoke with the head of that group and with a participant from Egypt who has a great analysis of the region that is better than most of the analysts you're ever going to see or hear or read in mainstream media. He should actually be an analyst for them, but most don't want to hear from him because he does not represent their favorite victim narrative. He's really brave too. You will be hearing from him in a future episode. First, let's get through next week and see where America stands in the immediacy of what we are facing with this election. On election night, here's my plan. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution has asked me to weigh in that night on media issues and misinformation and other related things. I think I'm going to be doing that, probably also on social media channels. I don't know whether I'll be putting out an episode next week. I don't want to crowd the already insanely loud clamoring that we will have across this country. But it's quite possible that I'll look at all that news and see what's missing that you need. And if that is the case, then I will jump in. Otherwise, I'll be back the following week. And I would love to hear from you. Let me know your questions, what you think I need to jump on, what the media is doing right or wrong, or what I'm doing right or wrong. There are 2 ways to reach me. Paid subscribers to the newsletter get first dibs, and they are responsible for a lot of the topics I cover on this show. Become a paid subscriber to the newsletter at my website, joshlebs.com, JOSHLEBS.com. Paid subscribers are able to message me directly. You also get extra content and can write in comments on my posts. You'll see. Everyone else, there is a form you can use through my website. You'll see where to click, and that allows you to send in questions and comments. And you can find links to all this stuff in the show notes. All right. Thank you so much for listening. I will see you either next week or the following week.